I see that our commissioners are present. I see counsel for the respective parties. At this point, we are at the place in our agenda that is entitled Presentation by Ms. Jost.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And I am going to have to ask Ms. Larson if she can pull in our panel. And I know that may take a couple minutes, and I actually, if I may, need a couple minutes to get the presentation, rebuttal presentation uploaded. Maybe I can do that while she's pulling in our panel, which would be the same panel as yesterday.
Okay, that's a big panel. Let's just take 5 and come back at 12:36 or something like that. That way you'll be totally ready.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Ms. Joseph, this is Hearing Officer Thomas. At this time, I believe I've located everyone except for Bob Bresnahan in the attendees list.
Great, thank you, Hearing Officer Thomas. Bob Bresnahan will not be joining today.
Thank you. Then you have everybody.
Great, thank you so much.
All right, Ms. Joseph.
Mr. Chair, if I may?
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure that the Crestone witnesses who are here this afternoon are the same as the ones who we swore in yesterday, and just remind folks that you remain under oath.
Yes, Ms. Mercer, they are the same as yesterday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You may proceed.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. And Ms. Mercer or Mr. Thomas, I would like to reserve 10 minutes for closing. So if you don't mind letting me know when we get close, that would be great. Chair, I am going to pull up a few slides that we had a quick work of over the lunch break. And what I'd like to do is just kind of note that, there was a lot to unpack. And so Dr. McMullen, Dr. Hall are going to address a majority of our rebuttal. And then our expert Kathy Stearman will also address some some continuing conversations between Extraction, Civitas, and Broomfield as part of the air monitoring program. So what I'd like to do is go ahead and bring up Dr. Hall and have her start with a few of her rebuttal slides that will address certain aspects of the Broomfield testimony that you just heard today. And that will be both their direct and their rebuttal testimony that we'll be addressing. So Dr. Hall, if you don't mind, can you please walk us through the slide that's shown on the screen and provide your analysis to the commission?
Yes, I can. I just want to start by rebutting a statement that Broomfield made in the direct. Broomfield stated, Broomfield recently shared results study, which found that adults living within 1 mile and children living 2 miles from unconventional oil and gas facilities may be at risk of developing acute and non-acute adverse health symptoms. I want to drive home here that this survey design, which was a cross-sectional study, does not measure risk, and it cannot determine causality. It cannot support this statement here. And here I have a figure just to drive home how a cross-sectional survey is done. When these surveys are administered, they will be collecting the health outcome, which here was self-reported symptoms, and the exposure to oil and gas at the same time, as denoted here by time going continuously in one direction, and you've got exposure and outcome pointing at each other at the arrow time. What that does, it does not allow for the symptoms to be established that they were after the exposure to the well pad. This means that someone may have chronic symptoms before they move to the well pad, and therefore those symptoms would not be caused by the well pads. Additionally, it's been brought up several times that someone has symptoms and they would be looking for a cause for those symptoms, and they would be more aware and looking for an environmental cause. And I just want to point out that that is actually a bias. So if the symptom comes first and then you're looking for a cause, then that is perception bias. And that is a person looking in their environment for a cause of a symptom that could be genetic or could be due to just some other factor like an infection. So again, I'm just going to restate that cross-sectional studies can only measure associations and they do not characterize risk. A much stronger study design would have to be used to characterize risk. And they cannot establish causality because we cannot determine if the symptoms came before the well pads or vice versa. Okay, next slide, Jamie. And then I want to briefly comment on the complaints that Broomfield collects. Complaints data is very important for public health to understand the community concerns and what health impacts may be happening in the community. But complaints data, again, cannot be used to determine that oil and gas caused these health concerns. Additionally, this data is reported here is a little misleading. It's saying there's 1,800 complaints. These are not from unique individuals. This is not publicly available. I can't determine how many unique individuals reported these complaints, and I can't determine if one individual is reporting complaints over and over again, and it's the same complaints or different complaints. I understand this data is protected health information, but there would be ways that Broomfield could be more transparent with this data and assign unique identifiers so that we could understand what these complaints are, of these complaints, and address them accordingly. Broomfield does have an oil and gas question and answer dashboard that we are able to look at. And I just wanted to point out that I did look at that data and found that 65% of the question and answers around air, odor, health, and noise were by one individual. And so that just leads me to believe that their complaint data is similar in nature. I think Broomfield making that transparent to the public would help answer that question. And that's all, Jamie. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And Dr. Hall, I do have a couple specific questions to ask you. First off is really tying back to the bias. So would people with higher interest in oil and natural gas participate in a postcard survey than people who are not interested? And could the responses likely skew the data because of that?
Yes, they might. And this is how bias is entered into the study. It's a form of selection bias for participants participating in the study. In this survey, there are multiple biases potentially introducing participation bias, from those wanting to participate to get their concerns heard and those not caring about participating, because this would be differential, meaning people that live closer to the well pads are going to, or likely due to the survey results, have more oil and gas and are likely to participate, while those living far away are less likely to participate. Perception bias from respondents is also being introduced, where there are individuals that may have symptoms and they're looking for answers to those symptoms in the environment, which those symptoms may or may not be caused by environment, could be caused by chronic conditions. And then finally, I'll touch again on the obsequiousness bias from participants wanting to answer in the direction they know the researchers are affiliated with, which is very apparent from that Broomfield thinks oil and gas development caused health impacts in the community. That was apparent by the direct that was given today. There are always other types of biases, and these were mentioned. I think these main three ones are the ones driving the results in the study. There are other ones like recall bias that could be influencing, but those are likely not impacting the results.
And thank you for that, Dr. Hall. So I do want to follow up on the obsequiousness bias that you just mentioned. Can you just please explain a little bit more in depth why that's so important for purposes of our discussions today?
Yes, I can. So I want to iterate that obsequiousness bias, it does not mean that researchers are necessarily speaking with the participants and telling them how to answer, but that would be the most extreme type of obsequious bias that could be introduced into a study. But what happens is when researchers are very open about their positions on the research, and here that would be Broomfield's position on oil and gas and health, and then continually to publicly share that position, especially with participants, like was done here through survey materials and also on the website. Then residents that are also upset about oil and gas are motivated to participate and answer in the direction that they know aligns with the researchers and their positions on oil and gas and health. Additionally, I just want to point out that claiming COMERB approval of the study does not mean it's a high quality design. COMERB is charged by the FDA, and I quote, "This group reviews and serves an important role in the protection and rights and welfare of human research subjects." So it might be argued that oil and gas was needed to be in the consent of the survey, but I would argue that the survey could have been more creatively administered, where it only evaluated health effects and did not mention why it was looking at health effects or what the source of those health effects may be. And this was done in two studies that did similar surveys to the one at the Broomfield Health Survey, Rabinowitz 2015 and Tustin 2017. They both received IRB approval, and they mentioned in their studies that they purposely did not influence the respondents with oil and gas in the survey or consent or any materials.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. I have just a couple more questions for you. So can you please explain to the commission how you conducted your analysis of the health survey and your experience in reviewing those surveys?
Yes, I can. We pulled the publicly available data, and I went about looking at the data like I would for large state surveys. I've looked at many large state surveys like the BRFSS, PRAMS, Healthy Kids Colorado, NHANES. So we first looked at the frequency of responses for self-reported symptoms by setback distance. And what I mean there is we looked at each category they answered. So if never, once in the last 2 weeks, all the way up to every day by setback distance. And what we were trying to find was some sort of exposure response pattern where you see people answering higher frequencies closer to the well pads. We've not yet tested the frequencies of the reported symptoms for each of these individual Likert scales by the setback because it's complex, but it is something that we're going to be doing in the future. The majority of the symptoms, if you just look at them visually by setback, you do not see a difference. There are a handful that I want to test as an exposure response. I would be happy to complete these analysis and provide them to the commission, as I'm very interested in elucidating these and understanding the data set further. But what we're able to do in the short time is to look at the average total number of symptoms by the setback distance and repeat the total Likert scores by setback distance. This would be the first step in any type of data analysis. It's the crude relationship between the well pads and the setback distance to the well pads and the reporting of symptoms. I just want to point out that this first step was not shown in Broomfield Health Survey results. The next step we took was to start to build a table 1, and I'm going to kind of do the air quotes, table 1. That's the table which looks at all of their factors like concern for air, noise, and odor, and its relationships with the total symptoms or the frequency of symptoms. This analysis is repeated for each factor: age, gender, comorbidities, concern, etc. And if there are relationships, even weak relationships, it's an indication that that factor needs to be adjusted for in the model. What I presented to you was the preliminary analysis that did not include that table 1. We are currently working on that to reproduce the models that Broomfield has done. I just personally feel that the results Broomfield Health Survey has provided are not very transparent. Questions that I have, I just want to know, what did the table 1 look like? What are these associations between these factors that were put into your model and your outcome, which were the self-reported symptoms? I would like to see the principal components analysis and the fit statistics with the coefficients to make sure that the groupings were appropriate. I would like to know the relationships with the confounders when they were put in and out of the model, and the linear regression fit statistics. Were all the linear regression assumptions met? We are going to continue to look at the data just to fully understand it. So that will take a little more time, but I'm happy to share that with the commission if they want it.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Hall. Maybe just 2 more questions for you. How far is the closest pad in Broomfield to the Coslet location?
The closest pad is 3.8 miles, and I believe it's the United pad.
Okay. And why is that important for our discussion today?
Important because according to the health survey, the reference population or control, meaning it was assumed as a safe distance from the well pads to compare the closer distances, was more than 2 miles away. So the closest well pad is well beyond what this Broomfield Health Survey analyzed.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Hall. And then finally, are there any additional statements you would like to present to the commission regarding Broomfield's direct testimony or rebuttal testimony, or anything you'd like to clear up for the commissioners?
Sure. I just want to restate something I stated yesterday. This study was useful and it gave us information on the population. And luckily, it did not show a large number of increased symptoms by setback distance to well pads, which is a good finding for public health. But it did show a lot of concern potentially around oil and gas activities, and that residents are concerned possibly that their symptoms are from oil and gas. This is an opportunity to reach out to public and educate them about the community air concentrations not being above health guideline values, the best management practice the industry has put in place, and plans that Broomfield or other counties and state have if something were to occur that could impact health. It also may warrant establishing health outcome surveillance in the communities to ease these concerns.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Hall. Now I'd like to bring up Dr. Tammy McMullen. And Dr. McMullen, I'm going to go ahead and flip to your first slide for purposes of rebuttal. I just want to make sure we can see Dr. McMullen. There we go. And Doctor, you're on mute.
Thanks, Ms. Jones.
Yes,
Can you see
thank
me?
you. Yes.
Okay, great. Got a few different slides here, so I just want to make sure. Also with my notes here. Okay, great, thanks. I just have a few points that I want to share with the commission again with respect to what Dr. Weisner and others at in Broomfield shared in their direct presentation. So first off, this slide that I have up here is, I just want to start by saying that I can really understand how the commissioners have some confusion about the complexity of the data that have been shared by Broomfield. In fact, I'm also a bit confused myself. To me, it appears that Broomfield has designed a really remarkable study that could optimize capturing near source plumes in very short timeframes to help delineate compositions of those plumes and characterize those plumes. While this is probably important information with regard to atmospheric chemistry and oil and gas, it's not the same as designing a study to estimate exposures to inform health risk assessment. And health risk assessment is intended specifically to understand and estimate exposures to a potentially exposed population so that it can be used for risk management decision-making like you commissioners have to do. So, however, though, and I'll reiterate again, I think Broomfield has actually collected a lot of data that can be relevant to understanding potential exposures and health risks. And those are the data that they collected in the community, not in the well pad. So I show this slide here because it appears Broomfield may be alleging that any risk is unacceptable, even if something is measured 300 feet away from a well pad. However, EPA explicitly addresses this in their air toxics risk assessment manual. EPA states that safe from a regulatory decision-making perspective means the condition of exposure under which there's practical certainty that no harm will result to an exposed individual. It does not mean free from harm or risk. If that were the case, then we would not have any type of industrial operations or cars or anything like that, because we're exposed, as they've even shown in our background air, to multiple compounds. Next slide, please.
Thank you. And Dr. McMullen, before we progress, if it's okay, I'd like to ask just one question as a follow-up on this. And I mean, so from what I understand from Broomfield's testimony is that, you know, they are saying no more new oil and gas development, specifically as it relates to the Coslet East location. And then effectively is stating that oil and gas should produce 0 HAPs ever. But if there's no oil and gas development in the area, wouldn't HAPs still be present based upon what you just said?
That's right. And Broomfield's data show that. I mean, you've got the data at their commons location that show that these concentrations are actually quite similar to the community concentrations. And you can also, I mean, collect data that, and CDPHE collects a lot of that data all throughout the Front Range, and they've got air monitoring networks everywhere. So these chemicals are caused by, you know, I mean, are emitted by a variety of sources, Ms. Joe. So.
Great. Thank you very much. I will flip to your next slide.
May I say one more point there?
Of course.
So as a risk assessor, if you were to do, for example, evaluating risk assessments, like doing Superfund sites or things like that, which I have experience when I was at the health department, often what you do is you're looking at the additional or incremental risk, for example, in areas, and that's like comparing to background, and that's why I've shown compared to background multiple times, because you can't get, I mean, unless, you know, you're going to clean the air, I mean, you can't get below background, really, right? That's going to be what EPA considers relative of all the other non-point sources.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that response. So Dr. McMullen, can you please walk the commissioners through this slide?
This slide is just, again, a little bit of what I just said in the last slide. So I really want to express that there are very well-established frameworks for quantifying health impacts associated to exposures from chemicals. And it's important to understand that the way we measure or model exposed populations, the way we collect that data are also well defined, and they have to be developed with very clear objectives to generate that data. My concern is that what's been shown from Broomfield is sometimes 60-second data, sometimes it's been averaged over 1 hour, sometimes it's at the well pad, sometimes it's in the community, and it's all been intermixed as though it can be discussed and applied in the same way. Whereas in reality, to me, these are very separate questions and objectives that are being asked. Are we talking about, like I said, very short-term emissions coming from a pad that might have very important objectives around understanding that, but it's not the way you design a study to understand the exposed population to get health effects. The reason I show this slide too is because this framework shows the integration between you do a risk assessment like those I had talked about yesterday and evaluating exposures to the public and comparing those against health guidelines. Typically, when we use real protective assumptions like those that have been used by CDPHE, by CTEH, and even at Broomfield, if you're just going to compare it to like a health guideline value, is what we call a screening level risk assessment. Okay, well, a screening level assessment uses very highly protective assumptions. And if everything is below at that point, you can say there's really probably no further need to mitigate risk, because what we call it, or what EPA calls it in risk assessment for air toxics, is called residual risk. So when you do not identify any residual risk, that is when EPA or risk managers would decide that mitigation of that risk has been successful. And that's what I wanted to share here with this.
Great. Thank you, Dr. McMullen. And with respect to the next slide, would you like me to go ahead and forward one more to bring the lines and questions on?
Go ahead.
There
Yes.
we go. Okay. Can you
Okay.
please, I know this is a revisit of one of your
Yes.
direct presentation slides. And can you please explain why we're revisiting this based upon Broomfield's testimony?
Yes. So it goes back to what I just shared. The question that I believe we're here today and yesterday for was really, do the proposed emission best management practices at the Coslet East well pad sufficiently minimize exposures and potential adverse public health impacts to nearby communities? Again, I want to reiterate that when you measure something 300 feet away from the well pad, unless there's somebody living there, while it can give us information of what might be emitted right from the well pad, a fence line air measurement does not equate to a concentration in the community. So why I'm so emphasized around the community measurements is because that is really what we need to know. That's a cumulative exposure. Ms. Josie mentioned again, background plus oil and gas. That is what people breathe. And that's what really does matter, right? So when you measure something in a community in that air, that's not just oil and gas, it's actually the cumulative exposures from all well pads around, plus the freeways, plus everything else, right? Benzene from all different sources. And that's what's important, because we do want to know what are people actually breathing in, because that causes a health effect. So that's why I just have kept reiterating that. And that's why I wanted to bring this up again.
Great. And really just to get an answer to the question on there, do proposed emission best management practices at the Coslet East well pads specifically minimize exposures and potential adverse health impacts to nearby communities? What's your answer?
Right. Well, so I shared a lot of the data yesterday, and I've spent a lot of time reviewing all of the available evidence. I shared with the commission the data from Broomfield, from Erie that have been collected from CDPHE and our studies from CTH. And it's very apparent that there's no indications that there's residual risk from these well pad activities that have similar BMPs to those that are being proposed at Coslet East well pad. Are there uncertainties in everything that we do, in every measurement? Yes, there are, but based on the evidence that I've been shown and data that CTH have collected to date, emissions from these well pads are unlikely to cause short or long-term adverse health impacts, and no further risk mitigation measures would need to be conducted to minimize this risk.
Great. Thank you, Dr. McMullen. So maybe this is a good point, just real quick, to confirm that last night, part of your homework was to review the CDPHE air BMPs for purposes of the Causeway East pad. And based on your answer that you just stated, it seems like one, you have reviewed them, and you're noting that those best management practices do act to minimize the public health impacts.
I want to just be really clear. I mean, there's lots of different air quality expertise. So I want to stay in my lane as a toxicologist and public health risk assessor, and understanding what the implications are. I'm not an expert in the BMPs. So, I mean, I reviewed and I looked at it, but you know, Kathy Stearman and others at CDPHE probably know a heck of a lot more than I do about actual BMPs. I mean, because I can't tell the commission that this particular BMP will quantify in this amount of emission reduction. I mean, they probably can. All I can tell you is that when I measure and when I look at all the data that have been collected, that have been measured where people live, work, breathe, or where they potentially might be, right? Because some of those were even at 500 feet, you know, or less that have been collected. When I look at that that measurement that I say represents an adequate exposure, and I compare that to health guideline values and look at it from that perspective, I do not see that the activities that are on the well pad and the emission controls and all of that are on those well pads that result in lower emissions, that's where I see that there's no adverse health impacts.
Great.
So
Thank you, Dr.
while I did review it, I just want to say that I'm not an expert when it comes to actual BMPs, but I am the expert that can tell you what it results in exposures.
Excellent. Thank you for that clarification.
Yes.
Okay, moving on. Can you please explain to the commission
Sure.
the purpose of this slide to rebut Broomfield's testimony?
Right. Broomfield shared this slide and spoke about that this shows long-term air quality impacts. Again, I'm going to go back to what I said. It's pretty confusing when we go back and forth between air quality impacts versus adverse health impacts to people. So a shift and change in air quality that's very localized cannot in and of itself tell me if something's actually going to cause an adverse health effect. So that really needs to be hit home. To me, this is an interesting slide. So it's a slide where evidently they've taken the data collected at near well pad locations at Interchange and Livingston, and then compared it to background locations. And then, so this is a relative change in concentrations, right, of what happened during pre-production and production. One, these are all near well pad location data again. So maybe some short-term changes occurred in total VOCs right near the pad. But it's also interesting to see that if you look, there's times when it goes below zero. So that to me says, well, there's actually times when it's near the well pad that the air quality was better than background during pre-production. The community locations, if you go back to the other slides I shared yesterday and that are from AJAX, those locations are actually indistinguishable from background, meaning there's no measurable difference in the cumulative exposures at the community locations compared to their background site. So to me, overall, these data do not necessarily say mean much of anything when it comes to actual adverse health impacts.
Great. Thank you, Dr. McMullen. And then can you please also explain your basically concern with respect to Broomfield's testimony for purposes of this slide?
Sure. So there was a lot of discussion back and forth between triggered samples collected 60 seconds and then methodologies that are used to extrapolate to 1 hour, because then you can compare it to health guideline values. So I just wanted to go to this slide again about the 60-second measurements, since the commissioners had a lot of questions about it. So we did take a look into this a little bit more deeply. So again, all these 60-second measurements that they showed, they cannot be directly compared, first off, to health guideline values because they're 60 seconds. And even ATSDR, the agency that developed the guideline values for benzene in particular, state that their value is relevant to exposures of continuously being exposed to something at least 1 to 14 days. So while it might be fine to just do as a screening assessment, it does not necessarily indicate anything about adverse health impacts. All 12 of these samples, again, were collected on their well pads, not in the community. And in fact, they were all, when you look at the community locations during the same quarter, there were no triggered samples. So the small change in a hyperlocalized air quality where people don't live, work, or play just cannot be assumed to have implications on adverse health. I can move quickly to the next one. I just saw the note.
Okay,
Of-
thank you.
again,
Can you
this
walk
is-
us through this slide, please.
Sure. This, Ms. Jost, is what I shared in the direct, and it sounds like it came up because there was a little bit of confusion about what proportion of these triggered samples have actually been in the community and what proportions have been above 9. I've just taken these data out of Ajax's reports and the information, and the commission is welcome to take a look at this again. But it appears, at least from our evaluation, that there were 8 triggered samples since the beginning of this program that were in communities. And of those 8, when you use Ajax's extrapolation method to the one from a minute to an hour, they were all below the 9 ppb in those 1 hours.
Great. And Dr. McMullen, just to confirm, this was a slide you had presented yesterday as well.
That's right.
Correct. Okay. Thank you. With that, sorry.
no,
One more, do we have one more slide?
There's just a couple more. May I go through those quickly?
Absolutely. Oh, yes, please.
I also wanted to point out to the commission this. It's not just Dr. McMullen speaking about air quality monitoring and how you monitor. I think this is a really important point. This also comes from EPA's air toxics risk assessment manuals that help us from us technical risk assessors. We follow it like the Bible. So EPA states that the selection of air monitoring locations to use in a risk assessment are critical because if they're placed in wrong locations, monitors can provide incorrect and misleading information about exposures. And that's, again, what I've just wanted to really bring home so that we understand clearly about what data we're looking at and why. 2 more slides and I'll be very quick, Ms. Jost. This next slide is, I take my hat off to the methodology that Ajax has presented in order to extrapolate from their 60-second to 1 hour. I'm not exactly sure why. If we want to understand health impacts, you can actually collect an hour-long sample. In fact, you can collect an hour, 12-hour, 24-hour, 1-week sample, and they are collecting 1-week samples in the community. So this, again, to me is a little bit of a muddled intention and purpose. If the purpose is to understand high resolution, what happens right maximum concentrations during the event of a plume, I can understand why you might take an extremely short sample. If the intention is to understand public health risks, then you should collect a sample just for an hour and you wouldn't have to do any extrapolation methods. The other last piece that's concerning about their methodology of extrapolation is really assuming like every single plume is all the same composition, the same proportion of chemicals, which we know activities on a well pad are not all identical. And then lastly, do you mind just showing the one last slide?
There you go.
I just want to provide very clear communication and clarifications of some of Dr. Weisner's points about toxicology studies and health guideline values, because a couple of commissioners asked. Well, first off, EPA and ATSDR use very standardized, rigorous scientific processes to derive these values, and they go through extensive peer review. I actually know this because I spent over a decade of my career conducting lab studies and spent a lot of time with these mice and rats and looking at these health endpoints Dr. Weisner just spoke about. And these studies that I did were directly related to how we develop these values. One, how old a study is doesn't matter. The quality of the study is what matters, and regulatory agencies look at that. And second, I'm showing you here with benzene, for example, even though it's a study in a mouse, actually it protects against symptoms that we know could cause headaches or things like that, which is up at like 50,000 part per billion when you actually see headaches from something like exposure to benzene. And so I just wanted to say that generally these are highly health protective. You can see that the studies and the acute value is at 9. And so I can speak more to that, but I'm just going to stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. McMullen. And with that, Chair, we would wrap our rebuttal and would welcome any commissioner questions or cross as well.
Thank you. So I believe that we have an opportunity for cross if Ms. Paranos desires. I think that's on the schedule. So do you have cross?
I do not have any cross, Chair.
Okay. Then I believe we would turn to questions from commissioners. Commissioner Cross?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And could we please go back to that last slide that you were just showing with Dr. McMullen, please?
Absolutely. Commissioner? This one, Chair or Commissioner?
Yes, please. And I just want to make sure that I understand everything that's being shown on this table. So first of all, when it talks about the headaches and dizziness, is that sort of showing like if you're instantly near that much benzene, you're going to get headaches and dizziness, or is that also an overtime?
That's a really good question. Okay, exposure and the health effects that can happen from chemicals require two things, and you hit right on them. One is how much, so the concentration, and the other is for how long, right? And that's why I hit home so much about collecting samples over a specified duration is really important. So with the headaches, that is over, it would be, if you have to be exposed to that much, and it'll actually happen, maybe quite quickly, right? Because at that high of a concentration, something like headaches will happen relatively fast due to our biology of, neurological systems and things like that. Whereas for something like headaches, at a very, you would have to get that kind of concentration. So unless, even at lower levels over longer periods of time, you would not see that. So toxicology studies are also done not just for short time frames, but they also are done for longer time frames, both in animals and in humans. For example, there's a lot of studies that are done like in workers, occupational studies of people that work, are with benzene and are exposed to benzene over long periods of time. And so they would look at those kinds of effects too. But in general, something like a headache, for example, and dizziness due to benzene and those kind of symptoms would have to be at these high concentrations in order to see those kinds of effects.
Okay.
That are well above what you could ever smell with benzene. And as you can see with the mouse study that Dr. Weisner had referred to at that 10,200 part per billion, that's the level where we see the most, these effects in mice. We use mice because, we use them as for laboratory purposes, right, and understanding toxicological properties of chemicals. And so that's 10,200 part per billion. This 9 part per billion is where you can see, that's where they have set this health protective guideline value. And that's typical. So these guideline values, generally regulatory agencies will look at what levels where they see effects or no effects. And then they add sometimes up to 1,000-fold safety factors onto it to account for sensitive, susceptible populations, for variability, for all the information that maybe we don't know or don't have in animals to humans, et cetera. And that's to ensure that even if you exceed a 9 part per billion, it doesn't mean that there's a health problem, right? Again, I go back to what I shared with you earlier, is these numbers are made for regulatory risk assessment purposes so that risk managers are able to make decisions about mitigating risk well before we ever believe that there could be impacts.
That's helpful. And what is the ATSDR?
Sure. So ATSDR is Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. They are a branch of CDC. They are the public health agency, the federal public health agency. EPA is the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. And so they both work partners and hand in hand. They both derive these protective health guideline values, although they use them for different purposes, slightly different, and they're sometimes different durations. ATSDR develops a lot of values for short-term exposures, where EPA has short-term values that they derive, but generally they're for emergency purposes only. And so when we're talking about short-term exposures, we as risk assessors will generally use ATSDR's values when we're wanting to understand the potential for short-term risk to general populations. So they're both federal agency regulatory kind of decision agencies.
Thank you. And then I think the last thing I want to touch on in this slide is, just so I understand, it says the chronic 1 year plus, and then the acute 1 to 14 days. That means that if you're exposed to that level of benzene for that period of time, that's where you'll start to get acute symptoms or chronic symptoms, or can you just explain that?
Sure. That's right. So like I said, because a toxic effect to a chemical requires both the amount of what you're exposed to and how long you could be exposed. When we do risk assessments, we look at first, well, what are we concerned about? What timeframes could people be exposed? So then the agencies derive these protective health guideline values to look at these different exposure scenarios. So acute for ATSDR could mean, yes, somebody could be exposed to that concentration, according to the data and the science, that concentration continuously for up to 14 days without any expected adverse health impacts. They're also very clear, though, it's saying that an exceedance of this value does not mean that a person will experience those health impacts. And the reason for that is because of what I just shared. You can see, for example, with benzene, that the lowest concentration at which any measurable adverse effect has ever been observed is at 10,200 part per billion. And then they add all of those extra safety factors on. So just because suddenly you've exceeded at 9.5, it's not like suddenly somebody's going to be, sick. So the same goes with the chronic. It's just the chronic, think about it. The reason the chronic number is lower is because that number is telling us basically somebody could be exposed to benzene, breathing that air continuously for their lifetime, 24/7, 365 days a year, 70 years without an expectation of an adverse health impact. So those are all the assumptions that are put into those. So that's why I said when I'm showing you these values and we're just comparing it, that it says it's below this number, these guideline values, we're assuming somebody is breathing that air constantly over that period of time, right? And that's why I say these are highly protective screening level assessments, because if it had exceeded, typically what we would do as risk assessors is not say, oh, it's unsafe. As risk assessors, you begin to refine it and go, well, that's not a realistic exposure, right? And you would reduce that uncertainty and you would get more realistic estimates. I hope that helps explain it a little bit more.
It does. And I want to tie this back in two ways to Broomfield's presentation as well. First off, without going into the veracity of the calculations done by Ajax. So we'll assume that the December 4th incident having the 223 parts per billion, that goes above the immune cell changes for the study of Chinese workers that's shown on this. Now you have the timeline of 1 to 14 days for acute and 1 year plus for the chronic on there, but I don't see timelines on the other. And so given that 223, if correct, is above that, does that have a similar timeline, or is that going to be something that, because of the amount, would be more likely to happen quickly?
Yeah, I'll try to answer it, but you might need to clarify for me just a little bit. So that 223 was that model estimated out of, if I believe, from the 60 seconds. So that's first off. And 223 part per billion, yeah, would follow right above this 100, you're saying 150 part per billion. That's right. So, and it would be above this 9 part per billion too. But then what I would have to do essentially to get a guideline value that could be directly compared to, something like that short-term sample, I would have to adjust this 9 part per billion. So up to something that would be a shorter time frame. So as as the exposure, I'm not explaining it well, as a short time frame, essentially what we do as toxicologists is we adjust these values. They can be adjusted such that if the time frame is shorter, the concentration could go up, the allowable or acceptable. I haven't done it for a 60-second because to my knowledge, in the world of toxicology, 60-second exposure to chemicals generally, is not necessarily be able to directly correlate with any kind of health impact. I guess I fill my tank in my car for more than 60 seconds. So, it has to all be put into relative perspective. So I don't know if I explained that well. To be honest with you, I'm not really sure what to do with that data. I don't know how I would deal with that as a risk assessor because there's layers of it being modeled, not measured. And it's not in a location where people were living. So.
And that makes perfect sense. And,
Okay.
and I think you definitely answered what I was trying to get at.
Okay.
As you move higher on what's labeled the benzene dose thermometer, less exposure time is necessary to have those effects. And so I guess, and as you said, you may not be able to tell, but given assuming the 223 parts per billion that was done with the calculation provided by Ajax is correct, just trying to see if you have an idea of what kind of exposure timeline would be necessary for some of those effects for that. I could do a calculation. We essentially just you can use a general estimate of what we do is concentration and time, right? So you just change those variables. You would start with like the 9 part per billion, and we know that was, or the mouse study at 10,200 part per billion, and we know that was over 6 hours, and you adjust timeframes accordingly. But I don't have a good answer right off. Okay. No, that's fine. And then I think
Okay.
one final question with respect to this slide. One of the things that Dr. Weisner talked about was especially the increase of things with like upper respiratory, nosebleeds, some coughs, things like that. Where, in your expert opinion, where would that fall on this chart?
Right. Well, let me go right back to one thing to what you just asked, which is about that immune cell change one at 100. So maybe this scale, I'm only showing concentration, not duration. So you're actually way ahead of me. You picked up on this pretty fast. I do want to note that study at 100 part per billion were Chinese worker study. And so that was actually ongoing exposures. So that required almost like occupational lifetime exposures really to kind of get to that. So I'm not really showing the duration piece here very well. Like I think the headache study may be half hour they were exposed. So I'd have to really get back to you on that. Okay. So to your second piece, could you reiterate it one more time to me?
Sure. So Dr. Weisner was explaining that some of the health impacts that they're seeing under their study include upper respiratory, talked about nosebleeds, talked about coughs, things like that. And so I'm just wondering kind of where you put that on here, because obviously at the 50,000 parts per billion, you're starting to get pretty quickly headaches, dizziness, that kind of thing. But trying to understand where, I guess, both with the duration of exposure as well as the amount of exposure, where you'd kind of see that come in.
Well, your guess is as good as mine because it doesn't link up to me. So the toxicity data for benzene, for example, benzene's not known to be a respiratory irritant. I mean, there are compounds that can be respiratory irritants, but it's not lining up with what we know are also posing the highest risks from exposures. So the information that we know are the chemicals that pose the greatest risk from risk assessment standpoint, what CDPHE have done and their health risk assessments, et cetera, are not the chemicals that would cause respiratory irritation. So that is a mystery to me. To my knowledge, I'm not aware of chemicals at any concentration except getting close to like immediate life or death that would potentially cause nosebleeds, other than perhaps a nosebleed could be a result of an irritant property, you know, of some kind of chemicals. So like I said, there are chemicals that can cause can cause irritation. Benzene is not one of those.
Okay. And then I think my last question for you, Dr. McMullen, is I just want to make sure I understand your testimony correctly here. You said that the shift in air quality over the short term doesn't necessarily correlate to health impacts. And I think you, in a subsequent slide, it specifically said cannot be assumed to have implications on adverse health impacts. And so I just want to make sure that we're clear for the record. So your testimony is you may have these increases in exposures from HAPs over a short period of time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those are what's causing potential health impacts, even if Broomfield's survey is correct that there are new impacts. It could be caused from a multitude of things.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's exactly correct.
Okay. I believe those are my only questions for now, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Cross.
Other commissioners with questions? Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Dr. McMullen, for coming back. I am curious to know, so I think what you had in your counter testimony was that this pad is more than 3 miles away from another closest pad, multi-well pad. Is that what you all said? Okay, so then are you trying to make the point that even if we took everything in Broomfield's survey as the best of the best data collection, this should not have an impact on residents because of the distance they are away, and the survey showing, or they only went, I guess, 2 miles out. So I don't know what it would say more than 2 miles out, but I'm just trying to understand what point we're trying to make here. So if you could help me.
Thank you for that clarification. That is what I'm trying to say. The study did not group more than 2 miles away. Everyone is just grouped into less than 1 mile, 1 to 2 miles, and then 2 are further away from a well pad. Let's just say the survey did show increased symptoms. They only saw it in the group 1 mile away from the well pad.
Okay. Is it possible that even though if you look at pads individually and best management practices individually, everything might stay under, let's stick with benzene since we're all talking about benzene, the 9 parts per billion. But if I'm exposed to pad A, pad B, vertical well C, vertical well D, there's a cumulative additive impact to me as a citizen, and that might explain why I might have nosebleeds or headaches, etc. Might there be some sort of correlation to kind of a cumulative additive impact I have as a community where there's a lot of oil and gas development or other development around me?
Commissioner McGowan, it's a really good question that I maybe haven't been able then to clearly articulate as much as I would have liked to. So when we measure air concentrations in the communities, so those communities in Broomfield that Broomfield has stated represent, people that live near multiple well pads. And then when we're collecting data in those communities, that measurement is total exposure, right? That measurement is that air is intermixed by the time, these VOCs disperse very rapidly because of their volatility. So over very short distances, they'll disperse. So that's an intermixed air from all different sources, oil and gas, non-oil and gas. So it represents a cumulative exposure, right? That benzene molecule, whatever we're measuring, is agnostic to whether or not that came from oil and gas or 470 or wherever that was. So that's the first point. That's why it's so important to look at data that are measured in the community like that when you want to understand exposure. The second point is we can also look at the cumulative effects from multiple chemicals. Dr. Weisner said that there's not methods to evaluate lots of chemicals at one time in the health impacts, and that's wrong. It's a standard, it's called cumulative risk assessment. It's very standardized in risk assessment, and especially in risk assessment with air toxics, and it's exactly what both the CTH studies did, and CDPHE does that for all of their health investigations. Well, what it means is that we assume worst case scenarios. So every chemical that we've measured that we think is related to oil and gas is added together and evaluated against a metric, what we call a hazard index, because there isn't just a one-stop health guidance number for a mix of chemicals because they all have different toxicity. So we can look at that and evaluate cumulative exposure. So somebody is not just exposed right to the one chemical of benzene, it's all these chemicals together that we've measured. So we look at that too. And that has also been repeatedly CDPHE studies and CTH studies. I haven't looked at all the benzene, I haven't looked at all the data from Broomfield because it's not available. But when you add all those together, you're still below the levels we would expect to cause any adverse health impacts.
Okay, thank you.
Does that help understand a little bit
Yeah,
more?
I think so.
Okay.
Again, there's we have dueling science, dueling data, dueling opinions. And, I think as commissioners, we're just trying to figure out, we have to go with the lowest common denominator because we're trying to protect the most vulnerable populations. We're trying to protect disproportionately impacted communities. Those are things that we talked about during rulemaking. And so, I think we're just trying to figure out like what the what is. And for Crestone, if you could remind me what kind of air monitoring will happen on the pad, and are we using canisters in 1 minute, or are we doing continuous? And how long does it take for that data to be shared with community? Maybe if we could talk a little bit about how air emissions are going to be, how that's going to be collected. I think that would be a good reminder for me.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner, for the question. I'll take that. We will be filing an air monitoring plan. Local governments will weigh in on it. Just maybe to take us back a little bit on some of the testimony we've heard the last 2 days about some of the events that we have heard Broomfield talk about, just to bring this back on how this kind of process has gone. Both the local government and the operator, us, which would have been extraction, and we expect Crestone too, have been really intimately involved with all of these events. So, what I would say is that we've been extremely responsive, and in almost, if I don't say almost every case, most of the cases, we've pretty much gotten together and discussed every single event, whether it was through a Zoom or a phone call. It's been treated with the utmost importance by all parties, which I think is really good. And we're going to expect that to continue. It's probably going to transition into an ERIE monitoring program and some of this cooperation and coordination. But to get back to your original question, we would expect that we're going to recommend a fence line monitoring program just like what we do in Broomfield. So that is another layer that we kind of communicate with Broomfield on, what are our sensors seeing at the same time as their sensors? And I can tell you, sometimes things go through the fence posts. We have our sensors even right next to theirs, and trying to kind of get a handle around all this data and the air homogeny, and even some of Broomfield's co-located sensors that are literally 6 feet apart has been challenging. But probably what will happen is we will come to an agreement that satisfies all parties. Typically what we've done is we've added what we would like to call a promulgated method, which is the EPA 325 sorbent tube methodology that really kind of takes us back to an EPA sanctioned method that looks at how the lab performs and how we sample and all the collection methodologies and standardizes all of that. So anyway, we are going to welcome all the input on this monitoring program. I would also say Erie's monitoring program, if I look at how it's positioned as relates to the COSLA East pad, Erie is in the area with their program right now. So that's kind of good news.
Further questions? All right, Ms. Jost, I'm not seeing further questions.
Great, thank you, Chair.
We now have a response presentation by opportunity by City and County of Broomfield.
Thank you so much, Chair. Yeah, we do have just a few points we'd like to raise.
Ms. Paranos, I have been giving parties a few minutes to gather their thoughts. Are you ready to go, or do you want 5 minutes?
We are ready to go now. I think after our presentation, I could use a few minutes to chat with Ms. Jost. So we could do that now, or we could do that after our presentation.
Why don't you do your presentation, and then after your presentation, we'll take a break, and then we'll go into closing statements.
Perfect. Thank you. With that, we are just bringing back Dr. Weisner and Mr. Valdez. Take it away, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone. So just a couple of points to make briefly. As I stated in my direct testimony.
Sorry, Andrew.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if anyone else is having problems hearing you, but you're coming in a little muffled to me.
Yep, he sounds like Charlie Brown's teacher.
Is that better?
Yep.
All righty. So just a couple of points to make briefly. As I stated in my direct testimony, Broomfield's complaint and response system is wholly separate from Dr. Weisner's public health investigation. So the rebuttal presentation seemed to insinuate that the two were related somehow. They are not. I showed the complaint data to make the point that whether or not the health impacts are provable or not, our community was adversely impacted. And all those complaints were real for those people, right? I will concede the point that we had many repeat complaints from many repeat individuals, but some people were more impacted than others. Second, I may have misheard this, but I believe I heard Dr. McMullen say that we have not had any community triggers with elevated VOCs. That's not accurate. So during the break, we were able to quickly mine our database, and we have a total of 19 triggers in community locations. And just a high-level snapshot of this data, 20% of those triggers showed a very clear oil and gas hydrocarbon signature. The rest were some mix of traffic where it's a little less clear and definitive. About half were within the normal background ranges, say 1 or 2x of normal background. About a quarter were small, low-level elevated plume captures. And the last quarter were clearly elevated VOCs with measurements 50x to 200x of normal background concentrations. And the max value for a 1 minute was 39.84 captured in 2020. Those are just the points I'd like to make. And I think Megan, Dr. Weisner is up next.
Thank you. A few points that I'd like to make as well. To Dr. Hall's comments that we can't support our conclusion with our findings, and we absolutely can, and it's our duty as researchers to come up with concluding points to our research. So we found an association, a statistical association between distance to oil and gas and symptoms like upper respiratory and acute. So we concluded that, we may be seeing these increase in symptoms due to possible explanatory reasons, such as elevated VOCs from our air quality monitoring system. That is that is something that we can do as researchers. We can make those conclusions. I also want to say that we are very transparent in Broomfield to the extent that we can be. Our health data is confidential, but we publish quarterly reports where people can review the number of individuals that complained, and this is separate from the health study, and the unique number of individuals that complained. So overall, in the last couple of years, we've had over 360 unique individuals. And yes, Dr. Hall is right. They have complained, multiple times, but that's why I always look at the number of unique submissions by unique individual. I also want to talk about the health study, and that, as Mr. Valdez said, the data collected for the health study was completely separate from the air quality monitoring data. We weren't trying to combine these, but these two data sets are very complementary to one another. So, we saw elevated levels of VOCs in our air quality findings, and that helped with our explanation about why we saw an increase in symptoms. Dr. McMullen, she talked about health guideline values for benzene. She did not talk about the shortcomings of health guideline values. And I mentioned some of those in my original presentation about how benzene health guideline values are developed. She showed the slide that says headaches occur at 50,000 ppb, but she did not cite what study that's from. And I'm unfamiliar with that study. And I'm unfamiliar why a headache would occur after you have immune changes in your blood. I also want to say that, air quality monitoring and more air quality monitoring, it's not going to protect public health. It's an after the fact thing. People are already exposed, or they're exposed by the time we see it on air quality monitors. So I want to make sure this commission is aware that in public health, we don't see air quality monitoring as some type of protective measure for our population. And I want to mention that I said earlier, there are no health guideline values for combinations of chemicals. They exist for individual chemicals, and that's separate from what Dr. McMullen said. I realize that there are assessments that can look at risk in reference to multiple chemicals, but what I meant, and what I hope what I said is what I meant, that no health guideline values exist for combinations of chemicals. And that concludes my rebuttals.
Commissioner, we'll move to commissioner questions. Commissioner Messner.
Thanks. Mr. Valdez, I'm trying to just make sure I understand what you said. So you've got 19 elevated incidences. 20% of those, 20% of something, which I think is 4, and then 25% or a quarter of that, which I think is 1. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm trying to figure out the actual numbers here. So we had 19 over, and my math is terrible, but I think 20% of that is 4, right? And then 25% of that is 1.
Oh, so I wasn't going down the line there. So just think of it as 20% of all of the plumes had a clear oil and gas signature. Of those,
so all the plumes, we have 19 plumes.
Yep.
So 20% of those plumes have oil and gas, so that's 4.
Right. So I was talking which ones showed a clear oil and gas signature and which ones had elevated VOCs. So there was a distinction there that I didn't describe perfectly. So think of it, of that 20% that I said had a clear oil and gas signature, some didn't have very elevated VOCs. Some did. So take out the 20% that had a low ion pentane ratio. Just think of it as we had 25%, so 4 or 5 that were basically background. We had we had 10 that were basically background. We had basically 4 or 5 that were somewhat elevated. And then we had another 4 or 5 that were 50x to 100x above baseline. Maybe I'll just show the data. Maybe.
Yeah, so we had, it's okay. I'm trying to figure out numbers here. So it's 4 or 5.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have 4 or 5 that have signatures of oil and gas. that are above, potentially above health standards. And of those, the highest was 39 parts per billion for benzene.
You got it.
All right, thank you. That's the only question I have.
Commissioner Ackerman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. And I'm not sure this is the appropriate time, but I've been doing some digging on the 250-foot setback versus 2,000-foot setback, and I just can't find any further information on it. While I'm a scientist, I'm not an air quality scientist. Sitting here objectively making the potential assumption that an old vertical well with tanks on the pad, emissions associated with that well could be similar to modern multi-bore wells once they're in production that are tankless. But I don't know. I don't want my mouth to write a check my body can't cash. And so I want to see if you have any information on that basis that you've made that decision on.
I think I can take a crack at that one. We spent many hours deliberating how setbacks would be codified. And at the end of the day, any setback is a political compromise. So that was what we landed on in Broomfield after testimony and discussion of relevant studies and documentation. There is no study out there that says X distance is protective of health. It doesn't exist. So where we landed was the result of discussion, deliberation, and a political compromise.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. And I certainly can appreciate the art that goes into making such a decision. And so if you referenced studies, if you have any relevant studies, I would be interested in taking a look at them. I do agree with you that I don't know that there is a study that sets forth a quote safe distance, but I would be interested in seeing the data that Broomfield has drawn upon for that decision if it exists. I appreciate it.
We do have a list of publications we used as briefing materials. We can send those to the commissioners.
Thank you. That's all for now, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Further questions? All right, I'm not seeing further questions, so I believe we are done with, Ms. Jost.
Sorry, Chair, I believe we have the ability to cross.
Yeah, go for it, sorry.
Okay, just two simple questions. Mr. Valdez, in your former role at Broomfield, did you personally track the triggers you referenced?
Could you clarify personally track?
Was that your job?
Like in the field?
So you mentioned that in your testimony that you had tracked 19 triggers and community locations. Was that you personally obtaining the information on those triggers?
Yes.
Okay. And then isn't it true that a clear hydrocarbon signature, to use your words, does not automatically mean an exceedance occurred, correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Chair. No further questions.
Seeing no further questions from the commission, I believe that we are now done with response presentation by City and County of Broomfield. Next up will be closing statements. Ms. Baranos and Ms. Jost, I think you wanted to talk to each other. And so if that's the case, then why don't we take 10 minutes and return at, let's say 2:05, a little more than 10 minutes for closing statements.
Perfect. Thank you.